All right, so how's everybody doing today? Everybody get done with lunch? Drawings for the prizes like every day? Oh, okay. This is the only day I've been here, so I don't know what the schedule's like. So, all right, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Chris Hopkins. I'm a consultant on the U.S. Services team at Microsoft. And today we're going to talk about an add-in that we developed and recently released for Visio 2010 and SharePoint 2010 called the Visio 2010 add-in for Microsoft System Center Operations Manager 2007 R2. So quite a lengthy name. Yeah, we had trouble fitting that on the title bar for the setup dialog, so it's kind of interesting. But one of the reasons that we're talking about this add-in is not so much that you can download this add-in. The add-in's free. You can connect your Visio diagrams directly to Operations Manager and get them to refresh. But part of the information that I want you to take out of this is that you can customize the Visio client and Visio services as part of SharePoint 2010 so that you can talk to pretty much any data source that you need to, right? Visio doesn't understand how to talk to SCOM directly. Neither does SharePoint or Visio services. You need some code in between. And this is the code that we wrote to facilitate that on both the client side and the server side. And one of the plans was to make this code available as sort of a sample to get people started, because this is really the only add-in that ships with Office right now, or it doesn't ship with Office, but is available with Office, that allows you to do this kind of integration on both the client side and the server side. So that's just something I wanted you to be aware of, is that we can make this code available to you, and this will give you a good example of how you can use some best practices to import any data you'd like into Visio, into your Visio diagrams, and then get Visio services to render and refresh those diagrams automatically from that data set. So was anybody in my session this morning on Visio services? Okay, a couple people who have not heard of Visio services before, or what that is. Okay, so a fair number. All right. Well, we'll get into that. What we're going to talk about, first I'll give you kind of a brief overview of the new features in the client and what Visio Services is, what that means to you in SharePoint 2010. But then we'll get into the specifics about this add-in and how we developed this add-in. So we're going to show some code and show how this add-in actually works to connect to SCOM. So one of the focuses was to create diagrams faster on the client side. So there's been a lot of new features added to the Visio client to just, ease of use type functionality. So being able to create your diagrams faster and easier. Things like being able to insert shapes, right? You have two shapes that are connected together. If you want to insert a shape today in 2007, you have to break the connection. You have to insert a shape. You have to draw your own connectors back in. You got to make your own space. Now you can just take a shape and drop it on the connector, and Visio will space out the shapes. It'll put the shape in there, draw the connectors for you, do all that. It'll even clean that stuff up when you delete a shape that's in between two that are connected. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff, a lot of ease of use functionality. I do want to point out workflows, because that is a big feature in this release. It's part of the Visio Premium Edition. So there's 3 editions now with this release. There's Standard, Professional, and Premium. And Premium has a lot of process functionality built into it for building process diagrams, BPMN diagrams, stuff like that. One of the features that it has is to be able to build SharePoint workflows. And then, of course, we have Visio Services, which is huge. So, I've been with Visio quite a long time. This has been an ask for a while, is to be able to take your Visio diagrams, put them on the web, so that you can share them with, virtually anybody, inside your organization, outside your organization. And today you see a lot of people doing things like publishing as HTML, making that available, or just sending out PDFs or JPEGs, stuff like that. But those are all static diagrams. So anytime even the smallest piece of data changes that affects the diagram, you have to republish that, send it back out to all your users so they can review it. Well, Visio Services takes all that away because it gives you the ability to just simply save your Visio diagrams to a SharePoint document library, and you're done. Users go to the document library, they click on the Visio diagram, and Visio Services renders it in the browser for them. If that diagram is connected to data, Visio Services will contact the data source and update the data in the diagram and refresh it based on how those shapes are linked. So there's a lot of customization. The session that I talked about earlier this morning, if you grab the recording from it, we talked about the basics on how to publish and do all that with Visio Services, but then we went a step further and built some dashboards using some WebPart connections that come out of the box. And we also used some JavaScript code that allows you to talk to the Visio Services API directly. So you can build your own rich interactive dashboard with these diagrams. Again, BPMN is part of this release. But now, the final point there is for the add-in itself. And like I said, we're going to talk a lot about its capabilities, but I want you to remember that this is code that you can write to allow Visio and Visio Services to access any data source outside of the supported data sources that ship in the box. Okay, so I talked about ease of use. So we have a bunch of functionality in the client to help you with building your diagrams. And I point some of this stuff out. First, you'll notice the ribbon, right? The Fluent UI that was available in some Office applications with the last release of Office. Now you'll see the ribbon in all Office applications, including Visio, Project, and even throughout SharePoint. The SharePoint UI is all ribbon-based as well. One of the nice features that was added, and this is a pretty simple feature, but it causes a lot of pain for people creating large Visio diagrams, is as soon as you run out of space on the canvas, right, how do you increase the size of that page, or how do you decrease the size of that page? And it's not very complex, but there's several steps you have to go through to actually increase the page size, to get the size you want to allow you to draw more on the page. With auto page size, if you just start dropping your pages outside of if you just start dropping your shapes outside of the bounds of the page, Visio detects that and it just creates another page tile for you in whatever direction you're going. So that's a real nice feature to help you. There it goes. They did a lot of work in the shapes window around search, around refreshing of all the shapes. So a lot of the shapes have been updated for this release. One of the biggest features that they added is what they're calling quick shapes. Now what quick shapes does is this lets you organize the shapes in your stencils the way you use them, right? So in the past, you maybe opened up like the server's stencil, and you've got a huge list of servers, and probably the two server shapes that you use the most are halfway down the list or at the bottom of the list, right? You can't customize that. But now you can simply drag those shapes into the quick shapes list at the top of the stencil, and they're right there at the top where you need them. And this view that you're actually seeing here, you can see that the quick shapes title bar is highlighted. That's actually the view of all the quick shapes in all the stencils that are open, right? So you're seeing a quick list of your favorite shapes, basically, for that diagram type. And like I said, a lot of the IT shapes have been updated. New shapes across the board for a lot of different areas of the product. One of the new shapes that so actually there's relationships now that are built into the engine. So shapes actually understand some relationships about one another, how they're connected. Containment is one, just a basic association relationship. So this shape is associated to that shape. That's kind of the underlying logic that's in Visio, but this surfaces in one of these features that I'm pointing out, which is called containers. And if you use Visio a lot, you're probably familiar with the group and ungroup commands. So you take some shapes, you group them, You can move that group around. You can copy it. You can ungroup it to get access to the subshapes again. A long time ago, that really wasn't originally intended to be used in that manner. It's more of a shape development feature rather than, a diagram creation feature where you're moving shapes around. So now we have what's called the container. And the container is just a Visio shape, but there's a relationship that's understood as you drop shapes just on top of that container. They're now associated with it. So if you drag that container around on the page, those shapes go with it automatically. And there's no selection behavior that you have to worry about because the shape is not inside of a group, right? It's a top-level shape sitting on top of that container. You just click on it to select it. You're not selecting the group, and then you have to click again to select the subshape. So it's a real nice feature that's been added. And there's other features like that, like callouts. You can attach a callout to a shape. If you move the shape, the callout moves with it. A lot of different relationship features like that. The quick shapes also show up in the auto connect functionality so that you can easily build the diagrams just by clicking on the auto connect button next to a shape. And you get your list of quick shapes and you just easily drop the shape that you want and it automatically connects. So this is really good with like flowchart type diagrams where you're dropping a process and a decision and then a document, another process. You don't have to keep going back to the stencil and dragging and dropping those shapes. And there's a lot more improvements, like I said. They really did a good job with this release, and they added a lot of ease-of-use functionality on the client side. Again, the workflow, just wanted to point that out again. SharePoint workflow, there's a special template in the premium release for Visio that allows you to build, to author your SharePoint workflows right in Visio. One of the features of this that's part of premium is the validation engine. Now, you can write rules, and when you open up the SharePoint workflow template, there's already rules that come in the box, right, that govern how a SharePoint workflow is validated. But you can use that rules engine against any Visio diagram, right? You can write your own rules. So you could say, my square has to be connected to a triangle, which is next in the list. And if it's not, when the user runs validation, they'll get a little error that shows up down here at the bottom that says, hey, you got a problem with this diagram. This is maybe something that you should go back and correct. So the validation engine is really powerful and can be customized. Again, with the SharePoint workflow, all the actions and conditions are supported, just like what you'd see in SharePoint Designer. And when you're ready, you simply export this diagram directly to SharePoint Designer, because you don't set up your parameters in the Visio diagram. You're just basically flowing out what the workflow looks like. And then once you get this into SharePoint Designer, you go ahead and you import it. You go ahead and you add parameters to all the actions, all the conditions. And then when you publish this workflow, there's actually a visualization feature, and this is using Visio services on the server side. So if you have a workflow running, you can click on the status and you can visually see the status of that workflow. So in this case, you see like a green checkbox next to a step in the workflow that's been completed. You might see a red X next to a step in the workflow that has an error. You can also export directly from SharePoint Designer, so you can do documentation on your workflows, or if you need to make some changes through Visio. But so on the Visio services side, it's basically a publish and consume scenario. So again, you're going to take your Visio diagrams and you're going to save them into a SharePoint document library. And then anybody that has just a browser on their machine can go to SharePoint, and those diagrams will render in their browser. They don't need the Visio client installed. They don't need a Visio viewer installed. They just need a browser that's compatible with SharePoint. Now the process is pretty straightforward. Again, you just create your diagram in the client and you save it using the new VDW file format to the document library. And that file format is a XAML-based file format. So you might say that, well, you need the Silverlight client installed, so you do need to install something other than a browser. But if you don't have SharePoint installed, or Silverlight installed, it will still work. You just won't get the vector representation of the diagram. You'll get a bitmap representation instead. So the quality will be less. If you zoom in real close, the quality will degrade, rather than if you have Silverlight installed, you'll see the vectors real clean. And so once it's up there, the consumer comes along, they click on the diagram renders. If that diagram contains any data connections to data that Visio Services supports, then it'll contact that data source automatically, get the updated set of data, and it'll come back and refresh that diagram. And the data sources that are supported are SQL Server, Excel services, SharePoint lists, and any ODBC and OLADB driver that you want to set up. Okay, so we talked about the Silverlight piece. It works well in a lot of different browsers. There's a lot of other browsers besides Internet Explorer that support Silverlight. Again, like I said, you'll get the PNG representation of the diagram if your browser doesn't support Silverlight or you don't have Silverlight installed. I just told you the data sources that we support. The one that I want to point out for this session in particular is the custom data source, because that's how we're going to connect directly to Operations Manager on both the client side and the server side. And then there's automatic refresh features, which really enables the dashboard functionality so that you have an unattended dashboard up. I know just down the hall, there's a test lab from where I sit, and they're using this add-in, and they have a Visio diagram up with their servers all drawn out, and it's updating every minute and showing them the status of their servers on this large display in the hallway outside the server room. So just gives you a real quick look into the health of the servers and what's happening. All right, so real quick, I'll just go through a demo where we'll publish, since most of you haven't seen Visio Services. So here I have a workbook that I've already loaded to a standard document library. This is just a basic SharePoint 2010 team site with no customization. And if I click on this workbook, what I wanted to show you was the data being rendered using Excel services right in the browser. Now this machine right here that I'm running, just so you know, this is running Windows 7. It's actually a bootable VHD image that I booted off of, and I only have 4 gigabytes of RAM. So I'm running Windows 7, Visual Studio 2010, and SharePoint 2010, all from this machine. So here's the Excel services data. You can see this mimics some data that I would normally pull directly from SCOM. But you can see my display name, you can see health state, maintenance, the typical information that you're used to seeing. And since this has been published to a document library, we can connect to it directly in Visio. Let me pull up my simple IT diagram here. So I'm going to connect directly to Excel services from that workbook that I published using the data linking wizard. And so from the data tab on the ribbon, I just click on Link Data to Shapes, and here the first option is Excel Workbook. Now there's a couple other data sources that are listed here. The client supports more data sources than what is supported on the server. Access database is one. You can connect to an access database on the client side, but if you publish that diagram, Visio Services can't access or can't talk to that access database. So we'll go with Excel Workbook, and I'm just going to browse out to my local SharePoint site. And then when I walk through the rest of the wizard here, it's going to pull down that workbook using Excel services. And this is functionality that is new to Visio 2010. Visio 2007 can connect to And then you can choose for this diagram some simple properties to tell SCOM how to lay that diagram out in the diagram view. So you can go by rows, you can set up containment, some simple formatting, but nothing like you'd get if you were using Visio to create the diagram. And so when you create the diagram, here in a moment here we'll see what that looks like. You get this hierarchical structure that's automatically built out for you. Yeah, question? Is it not? How's that? All right. Oh, okay. I see that play button's kind of maybe in the way. Oh, okay. So here's the diagram view. You know, and again, it has some nice features. You can click on the shapes, see the same health information. You can drill down into those shapes. Their diagram view tool automatically handles laying out, expanding, and collapsing those shapes to show you more detail about what you're monitoring, right? But other than that, the capabilities here are very limited, right? You can't really create maybe a diagram that you would like to see that fully represents like a dashboard that you would deploy out to other people. And they realized that, you know, the operations manager team realized that, and in the last update, they added the export to Visio button, which allows you to just create a Visio diagram straight from this diagram view in the console. And it's just a button on the toolbar. I know a lot of people didn't know about it because they see the more, you know, see more options drop-down button at the end of that toolbar if your resolution's not big enough. And it's like the one button that doesn't show up because the toolbar is a little too wide. So a lot of people didn't even know that you could export that diagram because they didn't even see the icon on the toolbar. But so what I'm doing here is I've just exported the diagram and I've opened it up in Visio. Now you can see there's nothing special here. This looks exactly like it did in our diagram view. And if we zoom in here, we'll see that the quality of the shapes is really not that good because Visio is a vector diagram based tool, and SCOM has exported basically bitmaps, right? So these are all just little bitmaps that it's exported and arranged on the page to look just like a Visio diagram. The other problem with this is that there's no data behind any of these shapes. Again, this is all static information. So if you did publish this diagram out, it doesn't do you any good. You have to continually refresh this diagram and republish it for the people that are using it. If you're just using it for documentation purposes and static is okay, then that's fine. But we can't refresh. So here, I'll restart Visio because this time I have the Operations Manager console, or sorry, the Operations Manager add-in enabled. And you can see right here that I have a new tab on the ribbon that shows you all the operations that you can access in the add-in. And so we'll simply open up that same diagram that we exported. The good thing about the diagram is that there's some metadata in that diagram that the add-in can look for to determine that it was exported from the Operations Manager console, and one of which is the name of the server you're connected to. And so when we open that diagram, we're going to just fix that diagram up for you, right? So we're automatically going to contact the server. We're going to pull in the data for the objects in the diagram that you're showing and add that as an external record set. And then we're going to automatically link all those shapes to the shapes in the diagram. And now you'll notice if you haven't used data linking before, the external data window down below is how we display all the data sets that you've imported into your diagram. And when you drop these records on the shapes, you'll notice the little link symbol there, and that means that that record is linked to at least one Visio shape. It could be linked to more. There's a one-to-many relationship there. But once we link that shape or that record to the shape, another thing that we did is we also fixed up that status image that was there, because again they were exporting that static status image icon with just the green check mark, and we replaced that with data graphics to make the diagram dynamic, right? And so now you can see if we change the state of that object just manually inside the Visio client, you can see the state change on the shape itself. And so now that we have the data linking setup and the data graphics setup, those are the two key things that we need for Visio services to be able to refresh this diagram, because that's how it refreshes. It refreshes the external data set that's attached to the diagram, and then any shapes that are using data graphics and that have data that's linked automatically refreshes. Now here I'm just showing you the links that were automatically added to those shapes, the hyperlinks that take you from the shape to the different web console views that you might be interested in. So the alert view and the health explorer view. And when we publish this to Visio services, those links are still active. So Visio services supports any hyperlinks that you've added to your shape, whether they're hyperlinks to other pages in the Visio diagram, or they're hyperlinks out to SharePoint sites or other external websites of any kind. So now we'll go ahead, what we'll do is we want to set up more of a dashboard. In this case, I want to just set up a real simple dashboard for my Hyper-V deployment. And so I've just got a single Hyper-V machine that's running a single image that's hosting my test SharePoint development site. And so I just really care about a dashboard that shows me the health of that. So I'll just go through here in Visio and I'll delete all the shapes that I don't care about. That server shape there on the right is the server that is my Hyper-V host. So I'm going to go ahead and move that to the top. And then a lot of these other objects, these objects underneath my Hyper-V server, I don't really care about. I just care about the health of the hard disk for that Hyper-V image, the local area connection, and then the operating system itself. So those are the only three shapes I'm going to keep. Right? Just delete everything else. And so now I talked about containers a little bit at the beginning of this session. I'll just kind of show that here, because we can take these shapes and first we can kind of do some alignment, because you see that's not very nice looking. Things aren't lined up very well. This is one of the new features on the client side for easy use. You see those little orange guides that are maybe popping up there? They're kind of hard to see on the screen. But as you move shapes around with Dynamic Grid, it's making some intelligent choices about how to align shapes and space shapes that you're moving around. So if you watch when we move that Windows service over, you see how it's doing the center alignment. And then when I go back to the hard disk shape over there, you'll see at the bottom, you'll see the little spacing indicators. Again, they're kind of hard to see, but they show up and the shapes actually snap as you're trying to drag them to help you out with that diagram. So now I'll just go to the Insert tab, and I'll insert a container on the page. And this is just going to contain all those shapes. Like I said, there's no grouping operation here. This is just a special type of shape that understands containment, which is a new relationship in the Visio client. And I'll just drag and drop all these shapes over on top of the container. And you'll see the alignment, the Dynamic Grid guides that pop up to help me align everything. And it's done. Now those shapes are associated with that container. And you see as I drag the container around, all the contents of that container move with it. So here we'll just make it look a little nicer. Again, that's my Hyper-V host. So I'll just connect that with a connector down to the Hyper-V image that I care about. And then when we get that done, there's a feature that's part of this add-in. I just clicked on the Add Status button on the ribbon. And this is a special shape that the add-in puts on the page for you. You could build your own. This is just a quick helper. But you'll see that that's just showing us the last refresh status and whether there was an error with the overall diagram on contacting the Operations Manager server to get the latest set of data. So with that, let's just simply add a background. So again, we'll just make the diagram look a little bit more professional. We'll put a background in there. We'll update some of the colors in the shapes. So for the container, let's make it a nice blue color. And at this point, we're pretty much done. We've built our dashboard using the Visio client. We've used the Operations Manager add-in on the client side to connect directly to Operations Manager to get our data. Now we're going to publish this to the SharePoint document library using the new web drawing file format. And that'll allow Visio services to do two things: render the diagram in the browser, and then because we're connected to SCOM, and we have our SCOM data adapter installed on the SharePoint side, Visio services will call that data adapter and get an updated set of SCOM data as well. And again, this is just a basic Teams site. There's been no customization on the SharePoint side. And we're sharing that, or saving that VDW file format. And then here, as soon as we save it, the browser is going to come up and it's going to show us the rendering again, like you saw in the first demonstration. And there's our dashboard, right? And it's being displayed using Silverlight in this particular case. And again, we can navigate the diagram. Any of the hyperlinks work. All the data is there, like you saw in the first demonstration. So we can select a shape, and we can see all that SCOM data that's behind that shape that's being refreshed automatically. Now you see at the top of the screen, I left my security settings set that way so that you could see it's telling me that the diagram is connected to data. You see that little warning up there that's asking me to trust the data source, right? Here I navigated to one of the hyperlinks, so it takes us right to the web console view, and I can navigate right back to the Visio diagram. I don't have to leave my browser for this experience. Now here what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and enable the session. Now on this SharePoint site, I've already deployed the custom data adapter that we wrote that talks to the SharePoint site. And we'll see that this shape updates here in just a second. So see the shape status automatically updates. It read that directly from Operations Manager in the browser server side. Now what I just did is I just copied the URL from that diagram, because some of you may spend a lot of time in the Operations Manager console. So one thing that you might do is actually create a web view in the console of that dashboard that's on the SharePoint site. So you simply use the URL and you create a web view in the console, and then you can see my VM dashboard right there in your monitoring navigation pane, and the diagram refreshes. It shows you your dashboard right inside Operations Manager. So that's another nice feature. So creating diagrams from scratch, I mean, this is similar to the demonstration that I just did where I attached to Excel services data. But in this case here, you're going to click on the Operations Manager tab, and you're going to configure the diagram. And this is where you'll enter the name of the server for Operations Manager. You know, optionally, you can put in the web console address so that those hyperlinks are created for you. And there's also an automated refresh feature, and that actually goes a lot lower than the client does natively. You can set it up to 5-second refresh. And we'll get to that in a minute. But here I'm just going to go and get some data from Operations Manager. So I'm going to pick a single machine. I used the Insert Shape feature. And this just drops the same shape that Operations Manager uses, the same bitmapped image. But it uses data graphics instead so that it's dynamic. In this case here, what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to run similar to the data linking wizard, but Operations Manager isn't a data source that Visio knows how to communicate with. So we went ahead and replicated that functionality in our add-in with what we call the Reconcile Shapes wizard. And so you'll see here, if I just run this wizard, again, I can choose all the shapes in the diagram. And then on this next screen, I tell it how to determine what the matches are. So in this case, I can choose network name, since I've already filled that out in my existing diagram. And I can choose display name. And then immediately it goes to Operations Manager and tries to reconcile and find all the management objects that match those shapes. Here you can see I have one that wasn't found. But in this case, I know what server that is now. Maybe it was a server that got renamed or deleted. I'll just go in and I'll manually set up what I want to link to in that case. I'll click on Next, which will show me the results of what's going to happen. And then I'll click on Finish. And again, we go through and we automatically connect all the shapes in the diagram to the Operations Manager data that we imported. And here you can see the links are all set. Again, similarly, in this diagram, a lot of the shapes are duplicated just to make the size of the diagram a little larger. So here what we're going to do is I'm going to use the data graphics feature again to just do our color by value operation. And so right away you can see the machines that we're having issues with, right? And then we'll come in here, and on the client side, like I said, we can enable automatic refresh, and we'll set that down to 5 seconds. And that's really nice because the Visio client itself, when you just normally connect to like a SQL Server database, the lowest you can go is down to 1 minute. And so we can connect and reestablish that, get that new data set every 5 seconds. And if we show this last refresh, this refresh shape down here, you can see that it's updating every 5 seconds automatically from that data connection. So now that this particular dashboard is complete, we can go ahead and publish it to Visio Services just like we did with the diagram that we did in the first demonstration. Any questions about the add-in on the client side at all and connecting to Operations Manager? Yeah.
A couple of questions. First one was, when you're doing the connection, you're doing the refresh like that, any idea how much data it's pulling down, and if there's any kind of load that it's pulling in, either on the SharePoint or the Ops Manager box at the back end?
Okay. So the load that it's putting on when you refresh the data, what you just saw there was just all client side, and we're talking to the Operations Manager API to get that data directly. I didn't run any load tests on it to see, like, if I was managing 1,000 machines and I went to refresh that data all at the same time, how long that took and how much resources it took on the other side. So no, I don't have that performance information.
The other question was, you imported the diagram and put it in a web view, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When you did that, is it able to pull up the, I think I'm getting this right, in R2 you've got this ability when you go to a particular device, you can pull up context, relevant commands of this sort of thing, can't it? Yeah, like if you go to an Exchange server, it'll pull up commands of this sort of thing that are relevant to Exchange and stuff. Is it able to do that same sort of thing?
Oh, in that web view?
Yeah.
No, there's no connect. It doesn't know what the objects are.
It's just kind of like
It's just a rendering of what was in the browser, right? Yeah. So when you build that web view, it doesn't know that that particular server is a SQL Server database, right? It just knows that this is a URL and I need to render that not the diagram but that page in this view. Yeah. Any other questions about? Okay. So on the server side, like I mentioned, that was all the client-side stuff. So we created an add-in that enables us to bring in the data from SCOM. Now on the server side, we need to do the same thing. So we need to develop a simple .NET assembly that we deploy to our SharePoint farm, right, that's hosting these diagrams. And whenever somebody visits one of these diagrams, Visio Services knows that the diagram is connected to our data source because we've set a property in that data source, the command string property, on the client side when we actually created the diagram. So without that, Visio Services wouldn't know, who to talk to, right? If the command string was blank, it would assume that, we don't have any data to refresh from. Our assembly, like I said, is very simple. There's an add-on data handler class that ships in the SDK. It has a single method that you implement that returns an ADO.NET data table, right? So as long as your code produces this data table that matches the schema that Visio Services is expecting, so the rows and columns that you have set up on the client side, you have to provide it with that same information on the server side when it comes back. If you try to insert another column or rename a column or do something like that, the schema is not going to match. So Visio Services is going to give you an error when that data comes back that it can't refresh that data because of the schema change. But once that comes back from your .NET assembly, then Visio Services just replaces the data set in the diagram and it updates any of the shapes and any of the shape data and data graphics before the diagram gets rendered. Specific with this add-in, we did develop a deployment package to kind of show you and give you an example of how you can take the .NET assembly and deploy it automatically to your SharePoint farm. Without that, you'd have to manually install it. And, sometimes that can be an issue if you have a SharePoint farm that maybe has 10 machines as part of the farm. You'd have to go along and manually install that data adapter to each machine and configure it on each machine. Whereas with a deployment package, it's just simple PowerShell. You simply run it, and it deploys that out as a solution to the farm. Now, there is some security issues with the, I wouldn't say issues, but there's some things you need to be aware about and how the data adapter talks to Operations Manager. Visio Services is running under an application pool on the SharePoint farm. And so, for example, the way I have my farm set up is the account, the credentials that are being used for that application pool, I've made that particular set of credentials a read-only operator on my Operations Manager server. So whenever somebody visits a diagram and Visio Services contacts my data adapter to do the data refresh, it's doing so using those credentials as a read-only operator to the Operations Manager console. So I just wanted to kind of make you aware of how that authentication is set up. And so, like I said, it automatically polls and brings the data source back, and then the PNG or the XAML version of the diagram is presented to the user based on if they have Silverlight installed or not. Okay, so let's actually take a look at the code for this. And this is, we can kind of open this up just to questions, see what you're interested in. I was just going to browse through the code, kind of show you the points. Like I said, we were going to make this project, all the code available so that you guys can kind of use this as a learning tool, not just for SCOM, but maybe you have a web service that you want to talk to and pull data from to update a Visio diagram. Well, Visio doesn't understand how to talk to web services, and neither does Visio Services, but you can certainly create an add-in on the client side like we've done, and then create a data adapter for the server side that can communicate with that web service. So here's our Visual Studio project. Let me make a little bit more space here. So you can see the different projects that we have. First, I'll just point out that this really consists of 3 different modules, or 3 different projects. We have the client-side add-in, which is all in the Operations Manager add-in project, and we have the data module in its own separate project. And then we have the shared project, which we're calling Data Helpers. And in here is where we have defined the schema for our ADO.NET data table. And you can see the object ID, the display name, etc. And then in a class that we have 2 methods. We have a method called getOperationsManagerDataSet, which is being called on the client side to connect to the server. You can see one of the arguments is the management group. And then we have another function that's called getOperationsManagerDataSet for SharePoint. And you can see it takes some arguments, the name of the server, the object IDs we're monitoring, status, etc. So that's kind of the scenario that we set up so that we write the code once for the data set, right? The client and the server are both using the same functionality to connect to and build that data table. Okay, and then on the server side, let me show you. This project is very simple. You can see the single code file that I've called data module. And if I come up here to the top, you can see I've got this single class in here that I've called Operations Manager Data Module. And I'm implementing add-on data handler. And again, like I said, that's got a single method that is called begin get data. And in this single method, I actually am setting up a thread on the queue for background workers, and that's going to call our thread worker. Let me come down here to the code for that. There's a bunch of trace information in this, just so you know, so when we release the code, because one of the things that's hard to do on the server side is really debug a lot of this information. So I wrote in the ability to set up a config file so that you can turn on tracing and write this stuff out to logs, so that you can see who's contacting the diagram, what credentials the diagram is using to contact SCOM, what are the objects you're getting back, those sorts of things. What your connection string is, because the connection string is really key. Let me go to back to my SharePoint site, and here's the VM dashboard diagram. Let me actually edit that in Visio. Because what I want to show you is the actual data set that's been created. Because it's the same data set that Visio knows how to manage. The only difference here is that the add-in is set the command string for us. There's our data record sets, and we only have one in here. And I'll just get the command string property. And let me copy that out to Notepad here. Okay. For a minute there, I thought I wasn't showing my machine. Okay, and so here's the command string. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to zoom in on this right now. But the first argument is the provider argument, and it's just set to .NET. So this tells Visio Services that it's talking to a .NET data adapter. The second argument is the actual name of the assembly. So this is just the assembly name and the class in that assembly that implements add-on data handler. So that's all we have to set, is just those two arguments. Beyond that, we have our own custom arguments that we're passing in. And here you can see I have the name of my server as the first argument, and then the second argument is just simply a list of object IDs. And these object IDs are what I pass to the Operations Manager API to get the latest data directly from the SCOM server. Yeah?
Maybe I'm totally in the minority here, but I came to the session because I'm a SCOM guy.
Okay.
So to be brutally honest, don't really care how it works in the back end.
Okay.
And based on the course description, it would seem like this is more of a SCOM add-in kind of thing rather than developer deal. I know we got probably 10 minutes left, but in the course description, you said you go over how to, what did it say, create diagrams to show objects by geography on a map, or location, or data center building. Are you able to get around to that? Or am I
Well,
way off base, maybe?
no, you're not off base. I mean, it's like I said when the session started, we talked a little bit about the add-in and its capabilities, but we really want to focus on the fact that you can write, your own code to connect to. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, and no, I totally agree with that. And I didn't write the course description, so no, I agree. If I could have changed it, I would have, because like you said, it's not about just building diagrams with the add-in. It's more about this is how the add-in works, and use this to go and maybe you want to use something other than SCOM, right? You have some other management tool. Maybe you want to connect to other data that Visio doesn't support. So it's more of a session around. This is. What's that? Yeah, sure. Sure. No, I agree. But is everybody same idea for everybody, or no? So different opinions of the. Okay. But no, I agree, because I read the course description and I went, well, it's not really, all that I'm going to talk about, but mostly on the data side. So again, this is on the client side for the add-in. That's the connection string that we set up, so that when this diagram is published, Visio Services knows what objects that we need to get from SCOM and the data set that it needs to get from SCOM. So with 10 minutes left, that's pretty much the end of the presentation. If you guys have any questions or comments about, more detail about how the code works, or yeah.
Did you say this code was going to be made available?
Yes.
Where?
Probably there's a site called visiotoolbox.com. A lot of third-party developers post their add-ins to visiotoolbox.com. There's a couple different SCOM and SCCM add-ins listed up there. That's probably where we're going to publish the code. There's already similar code that I've published on my blog. Let me If you can go out to Bing, you can search on my name, and you'll probably find my blog. Just look up Chris Hopkins and Visio, and that'll take you right to the MSDM blog that I manage. And a couple weeks ago, I published a simpler scenario that was more generic on how to develop the client side and the server side. And in this case, it was a very simple org chart type of diagram because I was focusing on, how to connect to data and get Visio services to refresh and the deployment around that. So, yeah.
I know there's a third-party product called Live Maps from Visio.
Yeah.
And this sounds something you could do something similar with here, in that you get a map, like a map of the world, or even a map of your data center, and then link your objects to the data center.
Yeah, they do a lot of similar stuff in their product. I haven't seen.
No, I don't mean to. I just thought, can we do something like that in Visio right here? Just the idea of, do we have any maps that are built in to Visio, or we can pull down from somewhere, where you can?
No maps that are built in. I mean, there's mapping shapes in Visio. So if you want to do like geography type diagrams, there's a whole set of shapes in the product that allow you to create just general maps. And then, of course, you can overlay any other shapes on top of that, right, and create drill downs. So if you had a map of like the U.S. and you had a couple shapes that represented your data centers, right, you might roll up some data and connect it to those shapes, showing the health of those data centers. And then just using standard like hyperlinks in Visio, you can connect those shapes to other pages in the diagram that maybe have more detail about that particular data center. And so I mean, they do a lot of mapping on their side with their product. Is it?
Yeah, just the idea is I don't want to buy something else. If I can use Visio, great.
Sure, yeah, no. And you could certainly, I don't have a diagram on this machine that shows, a map like that. But, there's shapes in the product, you can easily build that.
Yeah, sorry, you also said that you had something like this now, Visio diagram in the export position line, the exhibition hall. What about this then?
The exhibition hall?
The actual location where you have the diagram of the Visio.
Oh, so yeah, at the kiosk, the Visio kiosk that we have, they have a lot of different demonstrations. One of which shows, a geography, showing. I think it shows the U.S. And then it drills down, and so it shows that there. But they have that demonstration at the kiosk. Yeah.
You may have mentioned this before. Is this generally available right now, or is this not available for public yet?
The SCOM add-in? Yeah, it's on the Visio Toolbox website, and you can download it from there. I think they have a trial version of Visio 2010 and SharePoint 2010 too, or at least links to it, so you can download the trials. Because the add-in that we just released is for Visio 2010 only. Like I said, there was one a year ago that we released for Visio 2007. So it just depends on what version of Visio you have. But obviously the 2007 one doesn't work with Visio services. So. Yep.
Can I just chip in on that SAR-vision question?
Sure.
Just having used SAR-vision a bit myself, the main difference is with SAR-vision you can create an object and actually pull it into the console itself and then map in behind it. That's what I was just asking that question earlier on about the...
Oh, for the context?
Yeah, that's it. So you put things up in a context, you can then drill down from one map to another, and they just refer to map as being any kind of diagram.
Okay.
So I can see what the kind of split is between the two products here.
Yeah. So they understand what that object is.
Yeah.
Yeah, they understand that it's a SQL server and
Absolutely,
give you something you can do with it. Whereas, yeah. So.
The other thing you can do with it as well is you can use it to kind of create things that would be a graphic representing a service in there. So if you build up a service, you can have like a box representing that service and then take it across and then drill down from that into kind of the components below it as well.
Well, I mean, you could do similar thing in Visio, right? Because they're just Visio shapes. So really, if you have a router, a web application, whatever your object is that you're managing, right, that's just a record in your data set. So you just draw any shape on the page that you want and drop that record on there, and now it's connected, right? And then it's up to you to say, well, how do I want to show state? Do I want it to be blue, green, and yellow? or do I want icons, or and that's where the data graphics piece comes in. And then the drill down, of course, is like, okay, well, my machine's not healthy. Let me build another page with just the objects about my machine that I care about, hard disks and that sort of thing, and then set up a hyperlink. So that from that machine, I can just hyperlink to this other page that shows me, the details specific to that machine. So.
Yeah, I really like it. This Visio is really cool. I should be giving it a go when I get home. Toolbox site, definitely.
Another thing that we did for a TAP customer that was using Visio and Visio services is kind of similar to what you're talking to with, hey, this object is a certain kind of server, and let's show some functionality that we might be able to do with that server. Well, we used Visio services and the Visio services API because one of the things he wanted to do was he wanted his dashboard showing his machines, because all he was monitoring was hardware, routers and such. And then he wanted some buttons so that when you clicked on a shape, you had the ability to RDP right into that server. And so from his dashboard, we just wrote a little bit of JavaScript that talks to the Visio Services API in the browser. And so it can recognize click events. And so you click on a shape and it says, oh, hey, shape 123 was selected. And we look at the shape and go, okay, well, what's the IP address property? And okay, let's pass that out to RDP and start an RDP session directly to that server. So right in the map, he can just click on a shape, click RDP button, and right there he's logging into that machine and doing some work. So, but that was more of a custom scenario too, a little bit of JavaScript. So yeah.
Just do you have any samples about different kind of SCOM diagrams you can do in Visio? Because I like to sort of think outside of my box and maybe have something to
Sure.
published on the internet.
There's a couple different diagrams on that Visio Toolbox website that you can look at. One site that's not Visio, I think it's called like mynetworkdiagram.com. I think that's the name of it. But it's like a public site where people have posted some really intense network diagrams. Maybe not just SCOM related, but they're just building diagrams, for their network, documenting their network. And there's some really interesting network diagrams up there. So you might look at that, and that might give you some ideas on, how to format your diagrams different ways. Because this diagram that I was showing here, do I still have that one up? Site status. This one right here, it kind of looks isometric, right? But it's not really, because Visio doesn't do that very well. So you kind of have to know how to manipulate the shapes. Now, the computer shapes, the servers, they were already developed with this look. So the problem is getting these connectors and these background shapes to just, add some eye candy, but make it look like, it was developed for the same diagram type. Because if you just come in here and use your connector tool, and you try to connect this diagram, you're going to get, right angle connectors. So they don't have this isometric idea behind them. So really, those connectors and those shapes that are on there, they're kind of custom, right? So, and that's what a lot of people do. If you look at those network diagrams on that site, you'll see a lot of different techniques people use to diagram their networks. Any other questions at all? Yeah?
So when you were showing the API, is that like a web service API? Where you're connecting to in SCOM?
The SCOM API?
Yeah.
Or
Is that a web service, or is that just an API, regular API?
I don't know how they implemented it on the back end. When I'm writing my code against it, it's just a assembly, a .NET assembly that I reference in my code, and I just write directly against their methods. So they have a method, called get management object, and I give it an ID, and it goes and gets that object and brings it back for me. I don't know under the covers whether they're doing that via web services or they're using some other protocol. I don't know what they're doing underneath that for that communication.
Do you know by any chance the port that you're connecting to?
Yeah, I don't know that from my side. I don't know the port that they're using. That's probably something that they have documented somewhere, just for protocols that, they have to document what port and everything that they're using behind the scenes. But like I said, I just call a managementobject.connect and give it the name of my server, and it establishes a connection to the server. And then once I have the connection, I say, hey, go get me some data on these object IDs. And it goes and gets me those objects, and then I just pull out the properties, the health state, stuff like that. So I'm not doing anything with ports or web services or any of that. So it makes it pretty easy on my side, right? Because I can just create an instance of a management object and start calling methods on it. So under the covers on their side, I don't know what they've implemented. Okay, well, no other questions then. We can wrap up the session. So, in summary again, we talked about there's a lot of functionality on the client side. So if you're using Visio, check out, download the trial, check out all the new ease of use features. I talked about a few of them, but there's a ton of new stuff in the product. So, and especially, like I said, Visio Services is all new. It's part of SharePoint Enterprise Edition. So again, if you have Foundation or Standard, you're not going to get access to Visio Services. It's also it's also available in a hosted configuration. So if you've got like a BPOS account, you can access Visio Services that way. Or of course, if you're hosting it in your own server on site, then you have to manage it, but it's hosted there. There's the URL, visiotoolbox.com. When you go directly to that site, you'll see the links for add-ins. And so you just go to the add-ins tab, and you'll see all the different add-ins that we've published for Visio. And if you weren't in the session this morning, check out the recording if you're interested in more specific details about what Visio Services can do and what the API can do with a little bit of JavaScript code or web part connections. Then check out that. That was recorded earlier today. And then I know the show is almost finished, but there's the Visio Office SharePoint kiosks in the Microsoft Pavilion that you can visit. So, with that, thanks for coming. I guess make sure you fill out your evaluation so that you get entered into the prize drawing. So, and I'll be here for a little bit. If you still have more questions or want to see something else, feel free to, come up and grab me. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. BIU 03-INT. That's the session code. So a mashup is like showing some data in different contexts. Like you might have a graph showing you server performance. On the same page, you might have some KPIs showing you some health information. On that same page, you're going to have a Visio diagram, right? All that's related, and you can see that from all one view. So one mashup view, if you will, of whatever it is that you're trying to monitor or display in your dashboard.
So on SharePoint 2010, there's Visio Services, you got Excel services as well. Any other services?
Word, PowerPoint. So with Word and PowerPoint, you can actually edit. Well, at Excel services too. If you install Office web apps on top of Enterprise, then you have editing capability in some of those Office apps as well. So you can just, if you publish that Excel workbook, you can just click on it in the browser and type into a cell, change the contents, navigate back. It'll automatically update that diagram. Or sorry, not the diagram, the worksheet. Same with Word and PowerPoint. Visio Services is read-only though. So there's no web app that lets you do editing in the browser with the Visio diagrams. So you have to do the editing on the client side. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of your event today.